Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Kaplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be talking about the movement to green energy and the entire ecosystem that is surrounding it. And to help us with that, we have Jennifer Shaigec and Robert Bryce. Jennifer is a minerals expert, and Robert is the host of the Power Hungry podcast. Welcome, Jennifer and Robert.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Glad to be with y'all.
Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll ask Jennifer first because this really grew out of an article I did for National Post, which pointed out the little bit of a hypocrisy that the very people who want green energy but want to block the mining and processing of the minerals needed to get there. And that seems to be a big issue in Canada, and of course, Robert can address in the U.S. How is that shaping up in Canada? Is anyone making this point?
So I have a social media account on Twitter, and I have over 10,000 followers there, and a large part of my following is commodity specialists like myself, and we're very proud of our record in Alberta of natural resources and resource extraction in Canada. We're the cleanest energy source really in the world, and it's really frustrating. A couple of years ago, working in the energy industry, I was an energy trading analyst, and to see all of these policies affecting our province, and especially in the last 5 to 7 years, it's done so much damage, and it's really upsetting. So I've gravitated now towards metals, and I look at the Ring of Fire development in Ontario, and basically the development that is not allowed to happen. So this could just bring significant benefits to the Canadian economy. I think the figure was, over the first 10 years of development, we were looking at about $9.6 billion that it could contribute to the Canadian GDP. And in 2021, there were 3 First Nations groups that protested the development of the Ring of Fire. And so it's been on hold ever since. And you see things like that, and then you see power basically being handed over to these other developing countries like Indonesia, who is now doing a large portion of the world's nickel processing. And there it's very carbon intensive because they're reliant on coal-fired power. And so, you hear something like that, and that we have these deposits locked up in the Ring of Fire that aren't moving forward. And it's just really frustrating. And so you've got, the issue with First Nations, but then I think now instead of NIMBYism, we should be calling it the BANANA acronym, which is the build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, because that seems to be largely the way that environmentalists would like to see us go now too.
Robert, you seeing the same stuff in the States?
Well, I'll build on what Jennifer said there. There is no shortage of irony about what's happening in Indonesia, where the Tesla in particular, which of course is one of the biggest automakers, biggest electric vehicle producers in the world, they're sourcing nickel in Indonesia. And what are they doing to produce that nickel? They're building coal-fired power plants. So this idea of clean energy, I don't call it clean, I don't call it renewable, I don't call it green, it's alternative energy. I see those terms, green and clean and renewable, they're marketing terms. And we have been inundated by a lot of marketing around this idea of the energy transition. Jennifer mentioned the issue of nickel, and Joel, you mentioned cobalt earlier. I get a lot of press releases and a lot of information from commodity houses and so on. Adamus Intelligence just put out a report on the amount of cobalt that was consumed in June of this year, and who was the one leading the amount of cobalt consumed? Tesla, by far, more than twice as much as any other original equipment manufacturer. And so, to your point, Joel, Siddharth Kara's new book, Cobalt Red, is fascinating and a hair-curling read about the artisanal mining. That's the term of art for these small mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. These desperately poor people are mining cobalt in many cases by hand, and mine collapses are common. These people are dying in the mines by the dozens every year. And yet this idea about alternative energy and electric vehicles is going to save us from climate change. It is all being, not all of it, but much of it, to Jennifer's point, is being done on the backs of, or in the air of, or the regions of developing countries that are simply being exploited ruthlessly for their minerals and metals.
Well, and on top of that, I don't think that people appreciate that the actual production of these minerals is quite costly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, right? The general narrative in the world is that if we move to alternative energy, especially to electricity driven by solar energy or by battery-powered cars, that we're going to see a drop in greenhouse gas emissions, or the climate's going to get better. But the thing that people overlook is that it takes a lot of energy to extract the minerals, to refine the minerals, to get them to the point where they're usable in any kind of application. And my question is, if you look at it from a numbers point of view, does the amount of energy that's required to actually create a battery for a Tesla exceed the amount of savings that you would get in greenhouse gas usage?
I think that those numbers, to me, they still seem a little bit difficult to quantify. And one of the things that I discussed recently in a speech that I gave was so right now, if you look at the Liberal government in Canada, they've given $27 million in funding to a direct lithium extraction pilot plant. And I see money being spent on initiatives like that when battery chemistry is just changing constantly. And I just think it's almost impossible to keep up with that technology. And so that's why I'm saying I do believe at this point in time, it's hard to quantify those exact numbers. So right now, CATL, which is a Chinese battery manufacturer, it's responsible for 30% of global battery supply. They are leaning towards a sodium ion battery to replace lithium ion batteries. And with lithium prices skyrocketing over the past couple of years, they've made rapid progress on that front and exceeded expectations. And sodium is much more prevalent and abundant in the Earth's crust, is cheaper to mine. It's more environmentally friendly. Lithium ion batteries have issues with flammability. And here in Canada, nobody wants to buy one in my province because the range on them is limited and a concern in the wintertime when we get cold weather. So, I just can see so much changing in the near future in that regard, that EVs will get cheaper. But like you're saying, we still are largely, our power generation comes from fossil fuels in Alberta. And so if you're charging your EV and it's coming from fossil fuels, plus all the mined ore you need to manufacture these vehicles, it's still, like I said, it's hard to quantify, but to me, it just makes no sense. And I find that a lot of the experts in my field are kind of shaking their head at that. And, I look at solar panels and wind turbines, and like Robert was saying, I kind of object to the term renewables because sure, wind and sun are renewable, but to harness that energy, you cannot do it without these mined ores, and those aren't renewable. And so, I think it's a real issue that we have this disconnect from the supply chain. And I think that's part of what we need to start working on, is even in the education system, start talking to the youth there. If you ask them, what's in your cell phone? What metals are in your cell phone? I doubt actually anybody under 45 could even tell you. So I don't think.
If I could jump in for just a second, Jennifer mentioned CATL, which is interesting because I wrote on my Substack just a couple of weeks ago, robertbryce.substack.com, so we can talk about the ores and the minerals and the metals and so on. But the Ford plant that is being built in Marshall, Michigan, and Ford is partnering on that plant with CATL. Good Jobs First did an analysis on this. It's going to cost, each job that's created at that Ford plant will cost federal taxpayers $3.4 million. I mean, the numbers here are just, they truly are incredible. And one other point about just a quick one on the metals and the mining. I had a guest on my podcast, Simon Mee show, a few months ago, and we talked about ore and ore quality. And is any kind of mining operation, you mine the best stuff first. Well, we've mined the best ore quality that we globally that we found, and now we're chasing ores that are have lower quality, have less in terms of the quantity of metals that we're after in that ore body. So it means you have to move more rock. The more rock you have to use, the more energy intensive it is. So this effort to pursue the energy transition is going to require massive amounts of mining, and we're chasing lower and lower quality ores to get the metals and minerals that we need. So this is all, to your original question, Marshall, very energy intensive, and it's going to be hydrocarbons that are going to be burned in the pursuit of this. I think really what is ultimately going to be a massive waste of money.
Well, the one technology that would seem to be carbon free and reliable is nuclear. But I know, Robert, you've written about this, and in my work in Canada, I saw this as well. We used to mine a lot of uranium. We invented nuclear power basically in the United States.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that even this alternative, is leading us to be, if we even go for it, will essentially be dependent on the Russians the way it looks now. Is this a problem that the pro-nuke Greens are dealing with, or is this something that is just beyond the pale?
Well, a couple of quick thoughts. One is Jennifer's in Canada. Canada is really in a very good position vis-a-vis the nuclear power business, right? Because of the CANDU reactor, they don't have to even enrich the uranium. They can just take the uranium ore that they have and put it into the reactor, and they can make power. I mean, the CANDU reactor is really a marvel of technology, and the Ontario government just announced a big expansion of Bruce Power. They're also building an SMR. So Canada, improbably, and largely due to the work of Dr. Chris Kiefer out of Toronto, has really revived the nuclear sector in Canada, and it's been a remarkable story. But to your point, Joel, yes, nearly half of all the enriched uranium now globally comes out of Russia. 25% of all the nuclear fuel in the United States comes from Russia. There are no prospects for this new renaissance of nuclear power in the United States happening without a big and sustained, prolonged effort to enrich uranium in the United States. And it's not happening, not yet, not at scale. And so you're right. We have not, the supply chains for alt energy are clearly tied to China, but the supply chains for nuclear are clearly tied right now mostly to Russia. So we've got work to do, and a lot of it.
Jennifer, what is the situation like in Canada? Are the Canadian Greens as adamant against nuclear power as the ones in the United States?
I wouldn't say that. It's a little bit more difficult for me to gauge that sentiment living in Alberta, because we don't mine uranium in my province. We don't have nuclear power right now. And so I think if you speak to people in Ontario, like Robert was saying with the Bruce nuclear power plant, they're more pro-nuclear there. And so you hear a lot more about it. And it's not a sector I follow closely. And I'll be honest, because I was closely related to somebody that worked on business development for the Bruce nuclear power plant. And I would have lengthy discussions with him about that. And so, personally, I've never been so keen on nuclear power. I think there's a lot of risks. And it's interesting to me, too, when you see something like Fukushima, and you see they did polls with the Japanese people, and it's taken so long now for that population to come back around. And I think right now they're only at about 18% approval in Japanese society for expanding their nuclear power. And so my concern with nuclear has always been exactly that. All it takes is one incident, and it really turns people quickly against it. So that's one like I said, I don't follow particularly closely, because I've just always kind of assumed that would be the case. And in 2020, more nuclear reactors were being shut down than at any time in history. And I think there's a growing movement towards it, but I think generally right now there's still not enough of the population, at least that I'm aware of in Canada. And like I said, you look at countries like Japan, where they relied heavily on it. I still don't think that the sentiment is there globally to go forward with it. And then you look at France too. This year they had significant issues with drought. And so they didn't have water to cool the reactors, and they had to shut down a large portion of the country's generation. And so I think going forward, if climate change is the problem that people think it is, and we're going to face significant droughts, I don't necessarily think that nuclear will be the best solution.
If I could jump in, I'll differ with Jennifer here on this somewhat, because I was in Japan earlier this year, and the Japanese utilities are restarting their nuclear reactors. In fact, it was just on the 15th, just a few days ago, that Kansai Electric restarted their Takahama reactor. And so now there are 12 reactors in Japan that have come back online. And in our meetings in February and March with Japanese government officials and utility officials, they were all of the same mind that they have to embrace nuclear for energy security reasons. And they are. I mean, it's happening slowly, and there's still some, Japan has a long and complicated history with nuclear energy, let's be clear. And Fukushima Daiichi is only part of that. And I went to Fukushima Daiichi. But I would also say that globally, there is a resurgence in interest in nuclear, particularly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and particularly in Europe. France has committed to building new nuclear. This is coming from Macron's office himself. And I think we will see new deployment of new nuclear, whether it's SMRs or gigawatt scale reactors in Europe, before we see it in the United States, because they have more of an imperative. They have more of an energy security need for it than the U.S. does. But the nuclear renaissance is happening. There are a lot of obstacles to overcome, but I think it's real and it's going to continue.
Well, you bring up a really interesting question, which is the difference in progress by region, by country. And I just wonder, looking at the big picture here, is this just something we should be expecting, that there won't be a convergence of unified goals in the world and a unified direction until some either cataclysmic crisis happens or some other factor coalesces people together to be able to have a common policy? Or do you think it's just unrealistic to think we'll ever have a common policy in the world about how to make this transition?
Well, I'll jump in. Geography is destiny, right? That's one of the whole old lines in politics. And so this idea that we're going to have some unified approach, I think I don't see that happening. And why? Because in Southeast Asia and Southern Asia, what are you seeing? This resurgence of coal demand. This year, according to the IEA, we will see record coal burn, over 8.4 billion tons. Last year, China permitted 2 new coal-fired power plants per week. They're building coal-fired power plants in Indonesia. They're building them in Japan. TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, is building an ultra supercritical plant on Tokyo Bay in Yokohama. They're also building gas-fired power plants in Japan. Why? Because of energy security. So every country, I think, Marshall, just to make the quick point here, is every country is going to act in their own best interest. And so for China and India, it's going to be coal, because that's what they can afford and build and deploy relatively quickly. And they have growing electricity demand and growing industry. Same with Vietnam, Indonesia, et cetera. Europe is going to turn to the U.S. and other countries for LNG, and they're importing record amounts of LNG now because they're not getting it from Russia. So, this response is going to be based on geography and resources, and that's going to be true for forever, right? Each country is going to act in their own best interest. And the final point on Japan, what we heard over and over there was climate change is not their first concern. Energy security is. And Nobuo Tanaka, who we interviewed for my upcoming documentary, he said, we got North Korea over here, China over here, and Russia over here. We live in a bad neighborhood. We're gonna take care of ourselves.
What
Jennifer, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, because I was interested in, Canada has always been such a resource-rich country, and yet it seems to me like the last thing they would want to do would be base their energy security on something dependent largely on Chinese and other country imports.
I agree. And I think, my theory has always been that there won't be change on a front until it's impacting the consumer's wallet. And I think, you see there were all the savings from COVID-19 and all the money that was pumped into that with government initiatives. And so people were basically flush with cash when energy prices started to go up. And so, it was a little bit painful, but not painful enough to enact change. And so, you've seen now years of energy companies not investing in growth. They've just been returning money to shareholders. And I think that, and like Robert was saying too, the easy stuff is gone in terms of ores. Mining is becoming increasingly expensive. And so I don't think this is hit yet. And so you combine the shortages that we're about to face with a potential recession. And, it's great that society is looking at things like sustainability, gender equality, community well-being, but those priorities kind of go out the window when you're being hit in the pocketbook and you can't afford food for your family. And so I think what will happen is once you see these energy prices and commodity prices as a whole start to skyrocket, and like I said, combined with a potential recession, I think the green movement will get significantly quieter and you're going to see changes in voting. You look at Argentina, for example, they've just elected someone very right-wing. Germany has moved to right-wing as well. And I can see that happening in Canada too. The Liberal government is dropping in popularity. And I think that's what it will take is once consumers are hit, voters will vote accordingly. And that's when you're going to see changes that will probably move back towards traditional sources of energy that we know and are cheaper.
Well, of course, we're seeing a great example of this politically now in the United States and also in Canada, because I think now there are going to be Canadian plants that are shutting down. The UAW strike is really about electrical vehicles and a forced rapid transition. The same thing, by the way, is happening in Germany, where the car industry is much more important to them than ours is to us. It really is the signature German industry. So what I wonder is also if we're setting even the stage for the return of Donald Trump. Trump is, the guy is a total jerk, but give him credit. He's going to come out to Michigan and he's going to say, look, the reason this is happening is because Joe Biden has this mandate on EVs, and EVs are bad for you. And from a labor point of view, it's about 30% less labor from what I've seen. And most of the EV and battery plants are being located in non-union states. And Tesla is completely non-union. So I think, this is going to really affect the politics, the internal politics of Western countries, because they've put themselves in an indefensible position.
I agree with you, Joel. And I think, again, I'm going to differ with some of the things Jennifer said. I think, yes, there's going to be public pushback, but let's not forget just how much money is at stake here for the NGO corporate industrial climate complex. The Goldman Sachs in March put out a report that estimated the Inflation Reduction Act could cost taxpayers $3 trillion. I've done some estimates based on Wood Mackenzie report that the subsidies for solar energy alone could approach $900 billion. So the corporations that stand to make money off of this are going to be pushing very hard, and they have major and very influential allies both in Congress and in the NGO business, in what I call the anti-industry industry. And they have lots of friends in the media. So the money, the media, and the momentum is clearly on the side of this alt energy crowd, whether it's the EV stuff or batteries or solar or the rest of it. So there is a lot of money to be made here, and consumers are the last thing that is the concern of these big corporations who are going after the subsidy.
But wouldn't you argue that this is kind of typical when you have major technological shifts in the world? When the world moved from, whale oil to petroleum, the world changed. Here we have this entire move to a digital based digitized economy where, the reason why we're going with EVs and the reason why we have the strike in Detroit is that the EVs are much cheaper to make because they don't have as many moving parts. They don't have as complex a system as the internal combustion engine. So this is just natural. Isn't this just the natural order of things when you have major technological shifts?
Well, I'd argue no. Well, I mean, I don't think that we're seeing this. There are 284 million motor vehicles on the roads in America today. Who's buying electric vehicles? It's the Benz and Beamer crowd. The average price of a new EV last year, Marshall, was $66,000. This is not a working class vehicle. The bricklayers and the carpenters and the landscapers, they're not driving Teslas. Are you kidding me? So there is a very much, this is why I admire Joel's work so much, is he's looking at all this through the class lens. And that's how I see it as well. And Joel's work has really affected me, but this is largely, I think, a war on the poor and the middle class in the name of climate change. And there, as Rui Teixeira wrote a really good piece recently, I had him on the podcast to talk about it. The working class is not down with the energy transition was the headline, if I'm remembering it, Joel. But so this is about class. And yes, are these technologies interesting? But the electric vehicle is not new. It's 100-year-old technology that has been around for a long time, and it's not substantial. Yes, they're better, they're faster, but they're high-performance luxury cars.
Is the same thing true in Canada? The kind of are the conservatives now begin like the Republicans trying to become the working class party? I know you do have the NDP, which is a different animal, but and what do you think the politics in Canada are going to look like?
Well, you do definitely see us moving towards the right, but at the same time, the way our election system functions, I can see the NDP and the Liberals maybe joining together, and so you've still got the majority of the population that is voting in to the left in Ontario and Quebec. And so basically here in Alberta, where we're very pro fossil fuels, we don't have the voting power, unfortunately. So I think it really goes back to when it impacts the voter. And that's when maybe the voter will actually have a greater impact than some of these lobbying groups. And I totally agree with Robert in terms of the amount of money behind the green movement. Of course, that will affect politicians, but unless you move away from democracy, at some point, it's really going to hit the consumer. And so, we were talking about the declining ore grades, making it more expensive. But I think another thing that isn't talked about often enough, and I keep going back to our education system. I really think we're failing kids today in a lot of ways. But the University of Calgary a couple of years ago only had 8 applicants to their petroleum engineering program. They shut it down. And since 2014, Australia has seen a 63% drop in mining engineering enrollment. The United States has seen a 39% drop in mining graduates since 2016. And more than half of the US mining workforce is anticipated to retire by 2029. And so, it's not just supply chain issues, but we're already facing a serious labor shortage in the mining industry. And you take the environmentalist input into school curriculum now, and kids are not even looking at going into those industries. And so I think we're looking at some serious trouble for over a number of reasons here in the future that will cause skyrocketing prices for all of these metals, for fossil fuels. And I really think that's when you're going to see this sea change. And even lobbyists, I don't know if they can overcome that obstacle.
Yeah, this has just been a fascinating conversation. And as we move toward our conclusion here, I have one final question for you. And it kind of gets at this class notion that Robert was talking about. In order to be able to create change and get vested interests to realize that they're going to need to align themselves properly, the politicians are going to need to look at it and say, where are the votes? Where are the energized blocks of human beings that are going to perpetuate me in power? And how do you, with all of the money being spent to be able to romanticize the transition to green energy, how do you see what's the pivot point going to be for regular working people to be able to get their point across? Is it going to be strikes? Is it going to be other kinds of political action? What kinds of things do you see that would actually catalyze this?
I'll jump in. I think that, you know, Joel makes a good point on labor unions in America, but labor unions in America are not the political force that they used to be. And that they have, remember, the United Auto Workers has not endorsed Joe Biden, and they are withholding their endorsement. And so labor is not necessarily, I mean, their natural home has been in the Democratic Party for a long time, but that could switch. Now, will it? I don't know. But I think, you know, unfortunately, where so much of our politics now is being driven by super wealthy donors, and that it is clearly the oligarchs, to borrow the Russian term, and one that Joel uses a lot, and I think is the right one. They're the ones that are funding these big climate activist NGOs that are pushing this energy transition agenda, and including bans on natural gas, even though natural gas is the cheapest form of in-home energy. So, you know, will this class issue be the key issue in 2024? I think it should be, but will we have a strong enough Republican candidate, hopefully not Trump, who can make that point? One quick other point, which is that I think Jennifer made a really important point there about the retirement of mining engineers and skilled labor. And this is one of the other constraints on this claim that we're going to switch to alt energy. We don't have enough electric linemen. And this is something I've written about on my Substack just in the last couple of weeks, robertbryce.substack.com, that linemen are in such short supply that the investor-owned utilities are poaching them from cooperatives. So not only do we need linemen to maintain and upgrade the existing grid, which is aging and needs constant maintenance, we need linemen to add more capacity for EVs and heat pumps and all this other stuff. So this idea that this is going to be easy, well, it's not going to be easy. It's going to take years, and it's going to take a lot of skilled labor at a time when labor is short across all industries, and particularly blue-collar skilled labor.
That's a great
point. Jennifer and Robert, thank you so much for being part of the Feudal Future podcast. We're delighted to have you, and it's just one of the most stimulating conversations we've had. We look forward to having you come back and talk some more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The Feudal Future.